The Supreme Court has overturned the Chevron doctrine, marking a monumental and tectonic shift in administrative law. Here is the basics of what you need to know. First of all, what is the Chevron doctrine? It's a really good question, and I spent probably a third of my administrative law class learning about it, which I guess doesn't really matter now. Anyway, the Chevron doctrine basically said that if legislation that Congress passes is ambiguous or if it's unclear, then the federal agency that is tasked with creating and enforcing that legislation, putting it into actual policy and law, they are allowed, with their judgment, with their expertise, with input from the public, they are allowed to create the rules that fill those gaps. The best example is something like this. If Congress passes a bill that says everyone who is impoverished should get a housing stipend, and, the Department of Housing under the president gets this bill, and they're like, well, what does that mean? What does impoverished mean? Well, let's figure it out. Let's talk to people in the field. Let's look at other definitions, and then let's set the number of dollars, let's say of net worth, that defines somebody as impoverished, and let's go with that. Chevron was the Supreme Court case that allowed that department to have that autonomy to figure out, what does this term mean? Let's fill it in, and then let's act accordingly so that we can get Congress's law actually out there and taking effect. Now these agencies don't have that authority any longer, which means one of two things. One is that Congress is going to need to be more clear when they legislate. They need to say specifically, this is the rule, this is the number, this is the threshold, whatever the specific is, Congress needs to be more specific, because if they aren't specific, the agency's rule that they come up with will now be subject to judicial review by the courts, which also means that the courts in our country may be the ones deciding on the legality of rules and regulations that are in very, very complicated fields like healthcare, like automotives, like engineering, like cybersecurity. I mean, pretty much everything in our lives are governed by these rules and regulations. And many people are critical of this decision because they say that courts and judges are not the experts. And these agency folks, the people who work in industry and who actually provide input on these rules, they're the experts. We should allow them and give them the autonomy to figure these things out. The takeaway here is that Congress is going to need to do more work. Great. Now, if they could just do it. And there's probably going to be rules and regulations that are going to be struck down now because of this decision and the fact that these agencies no longer have as much power.